Mr. Rashwan, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us on the podcast today.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Dean.
Of course. So for everybody who doesn't know already, Hany is the CEO and co-founder of 21 Shares, now rebranded as 21 Co. It is a multi-billion-dollar asset manager. If I'm incorrect, it is one of the largest, if not the largest, European asset manager in the digital asset space. He's a very, very successful serial entrepreneur, a very close friend, and I'm very grateful for your time today. Thank you.
Of course. This is going to be fun. Looking forward to it.
So Hany, talk me through how you became who you are. I want to hear the whole backstory. Like, where did you grow up? How did you end up at Columbia? How did you end up in the entrepreneurial space, especially in payments and e-commerce? And then now, how does 21 Shares fit into the story? I want to hear from the very beginning.
Sure. So I'm Egyptian. I was born and raised in Egypt. I moved to the U.S., I think when I was 11 or 12. So that's how I picked up this voice. But born and raised in Alexandria in Egypt. My grandfather was a career intelligence officer. He was a cryptographer, actually.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was a general in the Egyptian army and military intelligence. He sort of got a PhD in computer science way before it was the most popular thing to do. A little bit ahead of his time there. Spoke 6 or 7 languages. He was a code breaker. And he's actually the person that bought me my first computer and taught me to program. And at the very beginning, I remember it was Visual Basic. And so I started off with the less sexy technologies out there. I think things really changed for me when I discovered internet programming, specifically PHP, which was a very quick way of getting your programs up and in the hands of probably tens of thousands back then, what we'd consider millions now, but certainly people. And that was really fun, I remember. There was the way computers were architected back then, there was something called the LAMP stack, which in a very simple way just allowed you to, within minutes, get something up on the internet, where even now, there are very popular frameworks on other languages like Python and Ruby. It still takes a while to deploy. I do think that there was something truly magical of calling any file, any text file .php, and then immediately being able to do whatever it is you wanted. So I ended up doing a lot of that. I had some of the most popular fan sites for games like RuneScape and Neopets and Power Pets and all the various things that I at some point was playing, aged 7 or 8 to 12 or 13.
And to be honest, were you scammed by somebody trimming your rune armor? Or did you fall for that?
No,
scam?
I didn't play that much RuneScape.
Other people doing that?
I didn't play that much RuneScape, and I think my top skill was woodcutting. So that tells you a little bit about what I was up in. I think Lumbridge was it? No, I was too busy creating like monster and character databases and quests, walkthroughs and things like that. I had dozens of people that were volunteer contributors on these websites, and it fascinated me having a community around it. It started with a forum, but then you have all this content, and it was really fascinating because you could also break new things. Pet colors were a very good example of this, but so were like new equipment coming out, because you'd have a script that, looks at all the permutations, and then you're like, oh, their mithril shield is coming out, or dragon boots in this variety is going to change colors or something. And that was really interesting, but that is actually how I learned how to program. I think by the time I was 13 or 14, I had about 750,000 unique monthly visitors on my websites, which is a lot.
So you're in Egypt. You have a little computer and you're coding all of this up there, or where were you?
So I've lived in 5 countries now in 8 states. So I'm not sure where exactly I was at which part of this, but between Egypt and America. And I think I learned how to assemble a team. Right, because I had this team of volunteers and avid gamers. Yeah, and it's a lot of people, and at some point, my father paying for server costs was getting to be a little bit out of hand, so we started advertisement. And I learned a lot about selling ads. We had a lot of impressions. It was a pretty good business up until I discovered girls at some point in high school.
As one does.
I would say...
all the coding
late high school, if anything, right? And all of a sudden, girls were much more exciting to me than pet colors and mithril shields. and that's my career as a as a game fan site baron here, and it all went sort of downhill from there.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Wait, so did the people in your community know you were 13 years old, or you're like operating as like an anonymous like profile pic, kind of like today, or how did you present yourself?
So first of all,
your fiefdom.
First of all, there are a bunch of people on these games that were 13. So I would say like my army of volunteers was probably, I don't know, half children like myself, right? There definitely some people knew. I don't think I was trying to pretend I was a 37-year-old man or something like that. Yeah. I think it was a very different time. It sort of reminds me of crypto Twitter in the camaraderie of the community, yeah, and how everyone there was their own unique snowflake in many ways, like not fully a solid average median member of society. And so I don't think my age was the thing that made me stand out. And in fact, there were a lot of people that were weirder than me. There were a lot of people that were younger than me.
That's super awesome. So if you figured out like a Patreon or equivalent back then, you could have been like a serious influencer, gaming influencer, like Mr. Beast or one of those guys. If you had started streaming,
it's possible. I don't think I was ever into anything that public. Like I think I love building public products, but sort of getting out of the way. And I believe that I was also the same back then. I do profile in a very specific way, and I doubt that I would have been Mr. Beast or something like that. I don't have his energy, nor do I have the ambition of being, that public facing, that out there, that public facing in that way. There's a lot of pressures associated with it.
So you were basically a RuneScape baron in cyberspace at 13. 18 discovered girls, so retired from RuneScape. And then how did you end up in Colombia?
I grew up wanting to move to Silicon Valley. Is sort of how if you grew up on the internet like I did, and if you grew up doing all of these things at aged 12 and 13, San Francisco was really the holy grail. And you would see the people that lived there and were doing this on a daily basis. So I always knew that I thought I would move to San Francisco and then live there for the rest of my life. That's what I thought was going to happen.
Had you been there at that point yet, or you just
never,
watched
never
videos?
never ever been there. I watched a ton of videos, and I would. I remember I would have when I was 14 or 15. I would have these realtors like send me new apartments and lofts and things in San Francisco. They did not know that how young I was, but yeah. I was really mentally there.
You're visualizing it already. You're like,
oh, of course. I knew where I wanted to live, which ironically is where I ended up living later. But I actually ended up spending 7 or 8 years in SF. Most of my 20s were spent in SF. I think when I was 17, my family had some business in California, and so we had a property there, and it was easy for me to travel and stay there, especially because you're 17. And I think I somehow got myself into a TechCrunch conference. It was before TechCrunch Disrupt. I think it was called TechCrunch 50 back then, and I believe I actually went to the first one, which was TechCrunch 40. A company called Dropbox had a demo there, so that's where Dropbox publicly launched. If you look into it, it went terribly. Really? Like the product did not work. It completely failed. It was a day when I really learned about the demo gods. And Drew didn't care. He was like, all right, well, here's a video, and this is what's supposed to happen. And then Sequoia put money in. It didn't seem like it mattered one bit or another. I had been doing this thing on the side, which wasn't super interesting, but had something to do with new video search. And I was trying to put natural language parsing on top of YouTube and build a search engine so that you can ask it basic questions and get videos nonstop. It's like, I want to feel happy with bunnies, and then some specific tagging would happen there. And so I was sort of cognizant that I was this 17-year-old at this tech conference. The tickets were super expensive for everyone who wasn't under 18. I think I went there for free because they were like, kids. But really, it was $3,000 a ticket, and people were paying. So I felt a little embarrassed to just be like, "Hey, I'm here to learn. I'm here to meet people. I'm here because I love San Francisco and Silicon Valley, and I want to learn more about it." So I pretended to have this be my startup, and For a couple of days, I was pitching this thing that I had been doing on the side for a few weeks. And I remember 3 people offered to invest on the spot. And they were like,
in the bull market.
100K or so. This would have been 2007, 2008. So like nothing as crazy as what we've seen now. But I remember.
So if you took that money and bought some Bitcoin, you probably would.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this was a couple years before Bitcoin would have been even created. But I don't worry. Later, I say no to $15 per Bitcoin, and even though it's in my hand and on my flash drive. But I think that's how I discovered Silicon Valley. I ended up studying the normal subjects. I think my first major was math. I switched into econ and comp sci after that. I very shortly dropped out of school and then did a failure of a startup where just learned by doing everything you're not supposed to do. Then had a medium success that we eventually sold. And it just so happened that the stars aligned where we sold it to a New York-based acquirer. And I had an 18-month golden handcuffs phase where I wasn't allowed to work for anyone else. And that's actually how I finished my degree.
You're forced to be there and sit there for 18 months.
Yeah.
So you was computer science pretty easy for you at that point because you had already done so much of coding on your own, or was it still like
it was super different from everything that I had been doing, to be honest. Like I think the way computer science at least was taught back when I was doing it, there's a ton of theory and
still is, yeah.
You know, a ton of discrete math and things like that at the beginning, and then you apply it much later. I had done it the complete opposite. So I would say I'm a pretty crappy programmer. I understand it, and I've written a lot of lines of code, but at no point do I think I'm qualified to really excel in that field professionally. It was fascinating understanding like how electrical engineering circuits work and things like that, but I wouldn't say anything that I had was super practical.
Interesting. Okay, so question for you: do you think that first failure is inevitable? You know, the most famous man on the internet likes to say that there's only one way to learn, and it's the hard way. It's either the hard way or the harder way, because humans never learn the easy way. Do you think that's true? Because in my experience, it kind of is as well. Like you have to kind of crash and burn on your first few tries at starting a business before you actually like realize, oh shoot, okay, there's so much that I don't know. Do you think it's possible for kids to avoid that kind of initial few failures, or it's inevitable? It's like learning to walk, you have to fall.
I think it's possible for you or I to go out and buy some scratch cards and win the lottery right now, right? I think that's probabilistically there. I think it's rare. And I think that you get these examples of Mark Zuckerberg or Evan Spiegel who were at the right time with the right product and did very, very well there. That's our current generation. I think a previous generation, those kids who would have made it would have been like obliterated in some way by the system. Because Mark, if you remember, was the first guy who really fostered founder control. And a lot of it was due to even his own team, Sean Parker's experience of getting screwed by his investors and things like that. And so I think it's incredibly hard, and that should not be the goal. I think the goal should always be super simple. And I think that's actually where a lot of first-time founders fail. I remember the conversation I had with my mother in dropping out of school. I never thought I was dropping out of school. And I eventually came back like 8 years later. But I thought, and my agreement with my mother was, I just got into this accelerator. I want to try this out for 1 semester. I'll be back in the spring. Because I thought, I'm going to go there. I'm going to do this. I'm going to sell it. I'm not interested in building a $10 billion company. I just want to make a few $1 million here. I'll sell this company in 18 months and then go back to school.
Good trade. Get out.
8 years later, right? It was like, whoa. And I think that too many people fixate on the goal and fixate on stupid goals. Like, I would like to be rich. I would like to have a $10 billion company. I would like to do whatever. And actually, you should focus on A, the journey overall, and B, taking it one step at a time, because no one that has accomplished any of the things that we aspire to do and the goals to reach there planned it that way. Like Mark did not sit down and say, I would like to one day be worth more than $100 billion.
Yeah.
He did this thing that 1 billion people used on a daily basis that then as a symptom led to that. And so I think that's actually a lot of the reason why first time stuff ends up being not the best idea. Like if you really care about the idea, if you're doing it for the right reasons, forget about product market fit. Before product market fit, you have founder market fit, right? You and I are intelligent people. I think we would struggle to build a candle making factory right now, right? Like we are not best positioned for that. And there may be an opportunity there, but I think people discount all of these highly important things that in the end tend to hurt them in some way or another, which leads to a lot of these first-time failures. I don't think we should shy away from them. I think failing is an incredible act, right? There is a...
Awful, though. It is awful. I don't know how big your first few were. For me, like, oh man, those are so, like, everything that you saved up till that point, seeing it basically wiped out, it is awful. And it feels like it's the end of the world. And then, a few years later, you're like, oh, wow, that's actually a small amount of money. And then you have an even bigger one, and you're like, oh, wow, totally. That's the end of the world. And then...
the way I treated, the first $100,000 that I raised, I was treating it as in a far more conservative way than I would right now. I think that... there are multiple ways of looking at this. Sports is actually a very good example of this. If you look at American football, Brett Favre was a fantastic quarterback, super well known, and people always fixate on, most touchdowns thrown or highest yardage of, over his career, that they would overlook the fact that he's also the number one in thrown interceptions, right? And no one ever thinks about that. No one ever looks at that. If you look at the highest performers, they've also epically failed. Because failure should be an acceptable denominator. You shouldn't fail 60% of the time. Depends on what you're doing, right? But overall, that's probably too high, unless it's a very niche field in some way. But you should absolutely fail maybe 5% of the time, 10% of the time, 20% of the dreams you have and that you work on should be so ambitious that if they were to happen, it would be such a huge inflection point that you should fail 1 out of 5 times, right? And I don't think that is a really negative thing. And again, we fixate on failure too much. One of the things that I think America uniquely does that is so far superior to a lot of other cultures, including my own, including in Europe where I mostly live nowadays, is this failure does not define you. Americans are still hurt by failure a little bit more than they should be, but overall, you're still accepted back. You're allowed to fail. Fail fast, fail often. That's how you learn. That's how you grow. And I wouldn't take that away at all. And if you're interested, there's a museum of failure, I think, in Sweden, where they display all of the stupidest products that the biggest companies in history have at some point launched. And you can, experience, I think Ford had, I think it was called the Ford Nucleon maybe. General Motors, I think it was Ford. It was a nuclear powered reactor in a car. And that's how the car was functioning. They came up with that idea and, worked on it. And it gets worse from there. There's nothing wrong with that, and I don't think it takes away from the Mustangs or whatever else they're doing.
Interesting. So Hany, after you sold and you finally got the certificate, was your mother very happy when you finally graduated? By the way,
I sold a company for a pretty good sum when I was 26 years old.
Wow.
And we sold for stock that then appreciated into the 8-figure range, which is not terrible. It's not terrible at all for a 26-year-old to sell that. And I thought I did something here. It was very difficult. And, I deserved to take a break. I'd never really gone to college for more than, a year or so. So I never got that experience either. I'd never really lived in this life stage. I sort of paused it or skipped it. And so I thought, time to visit Bali and Thailand, and I need a break. I'm super tired.
Oh, you did the Asia trip as well. Interesting.
I had the ambitions of doing it. Then I called my mother, and she started wailing and attacking, and she was totally focused on the fact that she couldn't speak to her friends about me because I was
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
embarrassing without a college degree.
Yeah.
And she was like, God made it so that the Acquirer is in New York, where you also went to school. You have to, if you want to remain my son, you have to finish your degree. So that's actually how that happened. I was planning on, gallivanting around the world and exploring what I had done age 26. But my mother had alternative plans. I appreciate it, though. I wouldn't have a degree otherwise, I don't think.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So then how did you get into 21 Shares? Talk me through the origin story of that, like from graduating college, or was there an intermediary step between college and 21 Shares?
So a big part of it was actually going to school is a very nice break because I couldn't work anywhere. I was still technically, I think, working for the acquirer, and you want to get the payout, right? And so you're going to do all of these things. And so I had basically a year and a half to myself. Most of that time I spent at school, where I took a bunch more classes than I normally should because I was 26 and I really wanted to do this as fast as possible. And I got everything out of the way in a year and a half, what I had maybe 3 years remaining or something like that. But there were times when I started thinking about what I wanted to do next. And I think something that I didn't mention, but is actually super important, I've only ever been in fintech. My first company was a checkout company. It was a one-page checkout that then became a one-click checkout. My second company was a payouts and disbursements API company. So I've been in fintech forever. I discovered crypto because my first investor was this guy called Tim Draper, who is very big in the scene, a little crazy, and in all the good ways. And he's the one that introduced me to Bitcoin. He
did that treasury buy, right? I think the U.S. Treasury was auctioning Bitcoin.
He's the one that bought it. I want to say the Silk Road's Bitcoin through the FBI or something like that. He was a bull from when it didn't make sense. That was the $15 per Bitcoin. I got a flash drive with $50 of Bitcoin on it. There were 3, and I have no idea where that flash drive is. That's sort of how I discovered fintech, and so I was always in this scene, and I really was thinking about what to do next. I was pretty sure that I wouldn't work for some random person or company. I knew that I wanted to do something else. And the sale was nice. It wouldn't have changed decades of my life, It was a start. It was an appetizer. It's like, this is possible. And I was evaluating a bunch of things, including something in crypto. I was also looking at insurance and small business banking, which I'm really still passionate about. But crypto was just super interesting intellectually. Like it was the first time that you have to realize this is 2016, right? So San Francisco still has not fallen. The playbook and my plan was to go back to San Francisco after my golden handcuffs. That was the Mecca. That was the only place that you could do anything there. And all of a sudden, I see something that being in fintech, in order to do anything from state to state, you needed a money transmitter license in both, let alone something global, let alone all of the extra restrictions and the regulated nature of fintech overall. It's one of those businesses, it's like the exact opposite of Facebook. Launching it globally is really, really difficult. And to this day, you get companies, massive fintech companies, Brex, TransferWise, Wise now. They're not available in most places, right? And all of a sudden, I saw this thing that was at a protocol level being built. And it mimicked a lot of the Mozilla crew and the open source kind of ethos and vibe. And I also saw a ton of people that for whatever reason prefer to live in Jakarta rather than, San Jose. And it was such a nice collection of ideals from what were some really incredibly passionate, at a minimum, people. And I think crypto, the way it worked is like it attracted the craziest at the beginning, and then the less crazy, and then the less crazy. And hopefully at some point, normal people can engage more with the system. But it was like the most intellectually stimulating thing. It worked 24/7. I was really drawn to it. And I didn't know fully what I wanted to do, but I did think of 2 main things. One, it was still really difficult to buy. Like at some point I realized this thing makes sense. This thing will grow in the future. I get it. And for me, it was, I don't know if you remember this, but the Greek banks had issues, the Cypriot banks failed, and then Egypt did a currency devaluation. And it was one of those instances where everyone in Egypt, basically their net worth was 50% of what it was, and then inflation was 35% that year.
Wow.
All of these were not ideal scenarios, and I started looking and seeing a lot of people buying Bitcoins to safeguard their assets, and it was imperfect, but I thought before this that crypto would be potentially, at its most interesting point, an index for the black market, which is not interesting, but just not what I was looking for. And this really broadened it in such a way that that's how I got into, that was my light bulb moment, how I actually started believing in crypto. And it was around the end of 2016. What I tried to do is just get my family to invest, because I was still in golden handcuffs. I really just wanted my family's investment office to put some money in, and to do it in a way where, we don't have a lot of techie people that are working on this. It's very traditional investments. It's healthcare, it's real estate, it's really boring stuff, and some stocks. And so it took me, I want to say, like 7 months to make the allocation. And it was like an amount in Bitcoin and an amount in Ethereum. It really wasn't that complicated. And I remember thinking, that was unnecessarily difficult. And I remember thinking, and I remember then it was such a, because I started off as a customer of these for my family. And I remember running into a lot of products that made no sense whatsoever. There were some exchange traded notes, which are not ETFs. They're not backed up by the underlying. You sort of are built on the credit worthiness of whoever the issuer is. They're still around in Europe. They still have more money than they should. There's significant counterparty risk, which, we're learning this year actually means something. And the issuer had gone bankrupt, like in the last year or so. They were bought out of bankruptcy. And so that didn't make any sense. I knew that no institutional investor, no investor that knows anything would do anything here. There were Swiss banks, Swiss actual regulated, like federally chartered banks that were charging 16% spreads and fun things like that. There was, of course, a pretty famous trust in the United States that was basically selling $10 worth of Bitcoin for $14 as a revenue model. And
good business.
As it turns out, it's not a very sustainable business over the long term. To build a business model that is built on screwing your users. But as a user back then, didn't think that was acceptable either. And so that was the first thing that I discovered, looking at a bunch of different opportunities, not really focused on this, but it sort of fell in my lap. I was like, this is really interesting. No one is doing anything here. The other part of it is that I want to say 95% of the people working on this were Americans working in America on this. And it was very obvious to me. I would say I'm a trained American. I'm not a native American, just given how much time I've spent here. But I would have bet back then, as I would have now, that the United States would not be one of the fastest movers in this. And that it actually, the best possible way of doing this would be to build it somewhere where you have absolutely no problems. You're very well aligned with the goals of the regulators and your chosen home. And it was this Goldilocks moment where you didn't want a tiny island nation, but you also didn't want a massive country where this is not the focus. And Switzerland, for us, was the perfect place. We looked at Switzerland, Singapore, and Dubai. It's interesting that Dubai has since risen, but back then they were not as ready. And meanwhile, this country was saying, we want to be crypto nation. Okay, well, you have no big tech startups. We're the most valuable tech startup in the entire country, and it's been just a few years. And we were super well aligned. And then if you look at a lot of financial history, a ton of stuff, a ton of innovations in the US, cannabis listed stocks, some commodity stuff back in the day, some cross listings, actually happened outside of America and were imported in from places like Canada or the UK or Switzerland, more reputable places like that. And so there was already a playbook. And that's eventually how we were able to do all of this. And why we did it first and why we're the largest now is because no one really was focusing on the kinds of places and really disagreed with our strategy. A ton of the biggest people in the ETF world, some of the people that are unsuccessfully trying to compete with us right now and really losing every day of the week are people who were very arrogant when we started and you know would tell me things like Switzerland, that's a backwaters. That's just a complete waste of time. And that was our contrarian bet that ended up paying off really handsomely for us.
After your golden handcuffs expire, how did you get this idea into motion? Who were your backers initially? Was you focus on one product, a few products? Like, what was the kind of road to now becoming, you know, you have dozens of products, billions of dollars under management? Like, that didn't happen overnight, right? So, like, what was, like, the first few steps? Like, how did you even go about to do it? Like, you spotted Switzerland, like, it's a good idea, but then, like, how do you then convince other people to back it?
So we had a lot of time and we really were interested, I think, in diligencing this as much as possible. So just to get to Switzerland, we looked at 27 different jurisdictions around the world. And by look at, I mean, spoke to most of them, right? You'd be surprised how many people in terms of regulators, service providers, bankers, all the people in this have their phone numbers and email addresses publicly available on their
Really?
websites.
You just called
We
them
just
up?
started calling people up, my co-founder and I. And so Ophelia and I would just call random people and try and get a meeting because it was too complicated on the phone most of the time, unless we got very quick no's. But we would try and get a meeting and we would then fly to these places. We'd fly to Doha, we'd fly to Singapore, we'd fly to Hong Kong and meet with them in the same room, put a suit and tie on, and try and get something across and try to see what they're interested in, what we're interested in, etc. So we really did a ton of that homework, which involved just honestly like speaking to users or building the product is really the two most important things until you find product market fit. We'd raised a tiny bit of money, but it wasn't like we needed a lot of money because I actually told all of our angels, like, we're still diligencing this. There's a reason no ETP or ETF had happened at that point anywhere in the world, right? We were trying to do something that had never been done, and that's difficult. And so I think we raised like $1 million or something to do this exploratory thing. Money lasted us for about 1.5 years of research or so. We then ended up raising a few more million. So we raised $4 million in total to launch the product. When we had the product ready and it was going to be launched and it was on schedule, it's publicly listed. It was HODL, the first physically backed exchange traded product in the crypto space. And we launched it in November of 2018. We needed a little bit of money for marketing and things like that, but still didn't raise too much. And then at some point it blew up. We focused on building the best products. All of a sudden we had the biggest product suite and one that had worked seamlessly in a lot of wars that we forget about, like the Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin wars, a lot of other contentious forks, ton of assets. We brought the first staking ETPs to market, and so people could buy a stock and not lose out on the staking rewards. Brought a ton of baskets and indexes. We had a Bitcoin short. By the way, several years old, that product. Did well last year. But I think in addition to, we sort of elucidated the space. We taught people what crypto was. We were doing it in all the different languages because we were European based, which allowed us to be international from day one. And then at some point, I think we went from 30 million in AUM to 3 billion within like a year.
Wow.
And the company also went from single digit annual recurring revenues to comfortable 9 figures. And, you know, we're sort of somewhere in between now, given some of the crashes, but still by far the largest ETP issuer, depending on what ends up happening with the largest asset manager. I think the future is actually quite bright for people that are aligned with their customers. And that's sort of how it happened, is that we built the best possible product and got a little bit lucky with the timing, but really had to sit and wait for 1.5 years of good growth, but nothing to write home about, as they would say. Yeah. And then it blew up, and we're a vastly different company today.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So when you got to, let's say, 3 billion AUM, you got this huge mountains of recurring cash flow coming in the door. what is going through your mind? Are you thinking like, wow, like we should, exit, we should continue growing this thing higher aggressively? Like, what is your thought process? Because you've already kind of exited 2 companies at that point. This is clearly something that's very valuable, right? Usually asset managers are valued off of the AUM, and there's some type of multiple on that. So you're looking at a potential, $1 billion+ personal exit at this point. What was going through your mind, and how were you thinking about things?
So I had actually only sold one company before. The first one failed. And the company we sold, it's funny because in retrospect, I'm glad we sold, and I'm surprised by how much the stock has appreciated and things like that. But in actuality, I was fighting that sale every step of the way. And I was forced to, by my investors, in different ways, both in not putting more money in, but also in pushing me, again, control the board and things like that, into this sale that I didn't want to do. I still believed in the company. I'm really just a normal mold of a founder here. I feel the same way about this. I think I'm not interested in selling. The way I think about us exiting in this way is that if this suddenly becomes less fun, or if we are failing at our original goal, which is to change the world and to add something to it and to do all of that, then we will sell. But it's not actually the goal here. And I think that if you build something that is important enough for the end users, it can become an enduring company. And if what you're interested in is financial upside, that actually is the best way of getting it over the long term in a sustainable way and at a bigger clip. But if that's not the only thing driving you, the intellectual curiosity of building an organization and a company, there's nothing like it. I think we are in such a fortunate position to be thinking about how to do all of these things. And so what happened when we first saw some success is we actually believe in this whole crypto thing. We are crypto natives, and it's really difficult to be the top, ETF issuer, one of the top asset managers in this space, and not think about the future of asset management, for example. We know how the sausage is made, and it's deadly sausage that's terrible and should be shut down. And there's a lot, and we know how blockchains are built and what they're capable of. And marrying the two was the logical next path. And so our customer profile for our ETFs and ETPs is a specific customer profile. I think everything will get tokenized. I think there are various places. The same thing that attracted me to crypto in the first place is the international aspect of it, the way anyone can interact with us. On our ETF side, only specific people can interact with us, those with connections to the dozen or so stock exchanges that our products are listed on. But what if I just want to buy something off of my MetaMask or Phantom? So that was an aspect that we're spending a lot of time, energy, and resources thinking about how to perfect, because if you believe in crypto, it's rather difficult to think that ETFs will be here 20 years from now or 15 years from now. They themselves only really being about a 20 or 25 year invention in the first place. And it's a mixture of that, a mixture of looking at a lot of financial infrastructure that we know is terrible, things that we've built internally that are far better, that we're selling now to banks, and really trying to build a crypto native investment bank from the ground up that does have an asset management piece, but obviously, the big companies that you would admire in this space, like Northern Trust, BNY Mellon, State Street, BlackRock, Fidelity, are very diversified businesses. None of them are crypto native. And if you think crypto is the future, then what we're building is a crypto native version of BlackRock. And that's how we advance this forward. What we call our infrastructure, actually, and we've been calling this since we started looking at this in 2017, even before we incorporated the company in 2018, is Onyx. Onyx is a BlackRock, because that is actually the guiding principle behind everything it is that we're doing and what our actual big mission is. And that's a much larger endeavor than whatever it is we've built now, as proud as I am of it. And will take some time, and if we're successful, we'll be far more impactful and leave an enduring trace on the world.
That's amazing.
So that's the goal.
That's amazing. So full disclosure, I'm an advisor for 21 Shares. I'm also an investor in your U.S. counterpart at Bitwise, Hunter. So Hunter recently has kind of gotten into the active management route as well. I think he's about to launch or has already launched some strategies with his new hire. Is that an area that interests you at all? Or you mentioned you want to be an investment bank, full service investment bank, but on the asset management side, obviously passive strategies are much easier from a headcount perspective and overhead, but also lower fees. Is active management something that you think you would like to get into, or what are the pros and cons when you look at that business?
Yeah. So first things first, I know Hunter as well. Terrific guy. We know the Bitwise crew really well. And we're very big fans. There are players in crypto that are absolutely gold, and they're definitely one of them. So we compete on a few things, but mostly we don't. And we really do believe a great tide lifts all boats. Bitwise is interesting enough that there are products actually where we partner up. And so they're exchange traded products we manage, we run on a daily basis, and we're always very happy to see them get AUM. I think that active is something that we've been asked about a ton, and we have shied away and will probably continue to shy away from it in the short term. I think at some point in the future, we will obviously do active. We think that it's too volatile a market right now. The market itself is so volatile on the basic assets, and there's enough ROI on the basic assets. And as a result, a lot of the infrastructure is more expensive as well. Our fees are higher than traditional ETF fees by a bit. A lot of that will change over time. But right now, we think it's mostly interesting to try and see how to invest in DeFi rather than building something that is very manually driven and could go up and down based on our own performance rather than the sector's performance. And so we've shied away from that. There are some things that we do like that are a little bit more actively managed. Some of our indexes, for example, change the allocations based on the actual metrics and usage of the networks. We have the smart contracts platforms index that part of its allocation and part of why it would say, I want to put more money in Solana versus Avalanche versus the Graph versus whatever, is actually GitHub commits, number of contributors, number of transactions, number of smart contracts on the platform, deployed on the platform, actual usage, actual metrics. And so that is a way of doing more programmatically active things, but nothing more than, let's call it very rules-based, programmatic ways. I think we'll shy away from doing manual anything and human-powered anything until the sector is a little bit more mature, which we don't see happening in the short term.
Interesting. Okay, that's awesome. And then in terms of the I know you've been working on some other projects as well under the 21 Shares umbrella. Could you speak about kind of which ones excite you the most on the near-term horizon?
Yeah, I think I mentioned one of them already. ETFs are a great product for some people. One of the things that we haven't seen really taking off is on-chain asset management in general. And that is with both traditional assets, the way we think about security tokens, as well as, generally speaking, indexes and baskets representing themes, representing some of the programmatic things that I've mentioned. It would be very easy to do on the blockchain. And a big part of why we're now under the umbrella 21 Co., of which 21 Shares is a part of, is that we want to build all of these different things as well. And so it will come under 21 Co., it will come this year. But you should be able to buy our products, whether they're in ETF format or Solana program format or ERC20 format, et cetera, for a number of different ways. And I think we've seen people like Index Coop and others build some really compelling products, but the usage is still not there. The UI, the UX, we think can still be better. But it's an area that we're actually quite bullish on in the long term. Again, for both crypto, non-securities, as well as actual security, real-world assets on a blockchain.
Yeah, totally. I know we saw recently KKR announced that they're tokenizing a portion of one of their private equity funds. So if that's the direction that things go, it's going to be a really different world. I remember when I first started playing with the blockchain, it was so clunky, and I was like trying to figure out like, okay, I'm paying like $10 to this to buy this thing that may or may not be able to get out of, and it's like it's come a long way, not enough. What do you make of the whole 2022 year? With the counterparties, the bad actors, et cetera, like, do you think that's washed out at this point, or like, where do we stand as an industry? I know there's still ongoing concerns with the DCG portfolio and obviously Gemini and associated. How do you think that impacts the market going forward? And what are some lessons we've learned, and do you think we've lost the trust of certain institutions entirely, or like what is your kind of understanding of the situation?
So I think the damage caused by, Sam being a criminal and others being at a minimum irresponsible, but probably in a lot of cases also committing criminal acts, is very short-sighted. It's going to cause us a ton of damage, and it's going to take years to convince some of the people that were very committed to jumping in to come back. I think the technological progress is inevitable. You're probably looking at the same things I am. Even in the blow-ups of Three Arrows or FTX or Terra, anything that had anything to do with a smart contract was being honored, right? DeFi really works. It has incredible use cases. And right now it has even more reasons to exist and unique value propositions and all of these important things. And so I think it's going to cost us years. This is not a casual thing. Sam was on the cover of everything. It wasn't a situation where we said, this smells really funny and investigated ourselves. He was a highly respected figure even within the community. And that is going to cause us some real harm. I think the march to acceptance is inevitable, but it does require us to get out of this short-sightedness. We need to build real products so that crypto, which today has been interacted with maybe hundreds of millions of people, primarily in a investment or speculative nature, I think we need actual utility, actual use cases for billions of people, something like a Facebook that can exist. And I'm not saying let's build a social network. I'm saying something that has that impact globally is what needs to happen. And we haven't been focused on that by and large as an industry versus doing, again, more short-term sighted things. I think we'll end up making the same money that everyone is trying to make with the short-sightedness, but you'll make it in a defensible way over a longer period of time. But really, I think that's what will end up needing to happen here. I think it's really unfortunate timing, and I think we really messed up there as a community, as an ecosystem, because this was our time to shine. And it is my belief that had Sam not been shorting Bitcoin and Ethereum, which is some of the rumors that are coming out, had Barry at DCG not been doing some potentially shady things with Bitcoin, creating artificial demand, getting all these investors who are institutional investors who wanted to buy Bitcoin and are screwed, or retail investors who will do the same, and even screwed temporarily, right? Because you should be able to exit your Bitcoin position in GBTC if you are truly following Bitcoin. You shouldn't need to wait 5 or 6 or 7 years or whatever the resolution will end up being. I think a huge part of why crypto has fallen this much in an inflationary environment had to do with our industry's greed, short-sightedness, and the amount of leverage. And I do wonder if we didn't have all of this greedy leverage built into the system, what would have actually happened? Because I actually think that Bitcoin at 30 or 35K is far better in a number of different ways than what we're experiencing right now. It is my personal opinion that had we not seen some of these shakeups, which are just built by each one of these individuals' greed and lack of long-term thinking, and sometimes bordering on criminal responsibilities as well, I wonder if that had not been the case, what would have actually happened in our first chance to really shine in a highly inflationary environment with an uncertain geopolitical future. We should have done better, and I think we would have if these artificial constraints that were self-imposed weren't a part of it.
Yeah, totally. I hear you. It's unfortunate, but like even when I think our industry and the markets overall oscillate between like immense optimism and everything's going to go to the moon and wag me, and obviously now everyone's like everything's a scam, everything's bad. I just like go back to thinking like right now, even if I want to pay somebody who's international, right? Like we got to pay like some serious fees just to get it to them, right? And crypto, like it or not, is a solution for that, right? Just very basic. Like I can send USDC to any person anywhere in the world. Obviously, you want to abide by KYC rules and everything, but in moments, right, and in a settlement or in trustless manner, and there's real use case there. And so, obviously, we both operate in the space, so I'd love to see the space do very well. But yeah,
But I think a very important point there. So everyone brings up payments, and I'm from the developing world. I am from a place where it's primarily cash transactions, much to our detriment as an economy, and things like that will make it better. I think Egypt is maybe the fifth largest remittance receiver in the world. So even on that angle, payments make sense. It's very public. We understand it. I think Americans don't understand Forex as much or the pain of sending international payments as much. But by and large, payments is something that I think is a very good use case. I think it's the tip of the iceberg because I actually think that with what's going on in Ukraine right now, obviously commodity prices are all over the place. A lot of people have made a lot of bets on sugar and wheat and oil and gas. And no one actually has any idea how our system is actually built, right? There are very intelligent people who operate within it who do not know how it is built. And so it's interesting to me that all of these people are buying oil or gas or sugar or wheat, and they have no idea how that contract settles and clears. I do because I'm in this one niche of the space. And I know that it is stuck together with tape. I know that there are trillions of dollars in it. I know that ETFs are this $10 trillion pocket, almost entirely manual, very Excel driven.
Really?
They make mistakes all the time.
No
Just
way.
automating it would be interesting.
That scares me to hear that.
But if you look at like the revenues of State Street and BNY Mellon and Northern Trust and JPM, some of the top fund admin platforms out there, that's quite interesting. And that's like a small part of the financial infrastructure that I happen to know a disproportionate amount. But payments is very much the tip of the iceberg in that it is something that we can understand, a significant portion of us can understand and relate to. But it is my opinion that the biggest impact of crypto in general is going to be on an invisible infrastructural layer, invisible to you and I, unless we work in it, that will vastly change how we do everything. From instantaneous payments, but also instantaneously settling a sugars contract is actually an incredible thing that would enable a lot of growth, innovation, market being bigger, market being more efficient, etc. And I think that's one of the tricks with crypto is that we try to explain to people use cases, but actually none of the people we're speaking to understands how it's built today, but they see some of the negative ramifications of it, right? None of our banks want the wire to take 5 days. There are reasons behind that. There are structural reasons behind that. And I think that's a point that we don't harp on enough.
Totally. I think another thing that I was visiting some of these third world countries last year, and something that I realized is that, like, for you and I, we take internet for granted. And, like, electricity and internet are not things that can be taken for granted in a lot of these, especially stable access to them. And so, like, very reason why they haven't adopted, I think, one of the core reasons is because there's no stable, low-cost internet available in, like, the public squares and the public, marketplaces. And so, like, even if they wanted to adopt a Bitcoin payment method, there's no availability, right? Like, even with my international plan with the best provider, I had like half a bar of service and I couldn't access, the very basic necessities. But what are your thoughts on that? Like, what is the solution? Like, I guess governments must invest in fundamental infrastructure in order to elevate the level of, standard of living for everybody, because otherwise they'll just be left behind, right? Like today, if you're not having high-speed internet and access to the global economy with the tools, AI, et cetera, and you're trying to sell like chips at a bodega, it's very hard to raise your family out of poverty.
So a couple of things. First, because I heard it and I'm Egyptian, we prefer developing world. There's the reason behind the third world is the Cold War, actually. The first world was America and her allies. The second world was the Soviet Union and her allies. And the third world was the rest that were non-aligned. For some reason, we've still stuck with the term, even though it doesn't make as much sense anymore. I think there's a Goldilocks moment, right? There are countries in the world where, to pick on someone in my own neighborhood, I think Somalia will have a tough time with some of this infrastructure. But, very important, but if you were to go to Somalia, they are doing crypto transactions. It's just harder, right? You can still do it on very basic smartphones running Android. you can have wallets, you can have things like that. So even in those kinds of places, they're still doing remittances, sometimes electronically. They're still doing some crypto transactions. I think outside of a handful of countries where what you're saying is true, if you look at Egypt, which overall is a big economy, but on a per capita basis, the average Egyptian is pretty poor. Internet is expensive. It's not that prohibitively expensive. And it keeps getting better and better over time, like on an exponential scale. Like Elon Musk is launching satellites that will enable internet everywhere. And that's important for two reasons. One is general availability, but the other is general availability of a non-censored web, right? So if you think about the Great Firewall or the smaller versions of it, of which Egypt has a smaller firewall as an example, it becomes harder to do those kinds of things in practice with more ubiquitous technology. And I think we're getting there. It's improving on a very exponential scale. But think about it this way. Let's pick Switzerland, where the internet has been great for years and years and years. Without anything in crypto being built, it's not like you would be able to do anything with just a fast connection. And so I think we need to concentrate on the same. We need to build applications that can be really used by real people for real use cases. And in the same way that Facebook optimizes their app and Twitter optimizes their app, so that if you are in Sierra Leone and the internet bars are the internet strength is not as strong as if you were in Singapore, you can still use Twitter, you can still use Facebook. We should focus on that. And I see a lot of, actually, to go back to my neighborhood, African entrepreneurs who are doing exceptional things in crypto. And a lot of how they think about designing these things involves knowing that internet is intermittent, knowing the signal's not that high, knowing the equipment, the phones themselves are probably not the most sophisticated or even current generation of products. And I don't think that has too much of an effect. It's a constraint, but that's how we build innovation. And I think everyone that you've described in every one of these places uses SMS. Everybody, right? Everybody uses SMS. WhatsApp is used by billions and billions of people, and they're looking at it for weather and other things. I think adding money to it is not insurmountable.
Understood. Makes sense. Hany, I could talk to you for hours. Thank you so much for your time. Any other final things that you would like to tell the audience about 21 Shares, what you're building, the future, etc.?
Go to 21.co. It's the parent company, and it has everything under 21 Shares and our tokens business that is going to have some releases soon. Follow us on Twitter, and it's at 21co _ at 21 Shares. I'm at Hany. And the only thing I wished to leave, and I try to leave this in every room, try and think more in long-term scenarios. The biggest lesson I learned from my first startup is that smart people will spend 4 or 5 years working on something, whether it is a good idea or not. And so if you think more in 5-year increments rather than 6-month increments, you'll end up doing much more impactful, much more defensible, and I think much more financially lucrative work at the end of the day anyways. So not enough of us think in the long term, and our space is a little bit more guilty of that in the past couple of years than most of others. So I would really caution us and hope we can fix that as soon as possible.
Awesome. Hany, Rashwan, thank you so much